She is a CUNY grad. She taught at CUNY's York College for 22 years and served as the provost at Hostos from 2002 to 2008. She was the president of Naugatuck Valley Community College in Connecticut from 2008 to 2020. Returned to Hostos in August of 2020 as interim president to lead us through the pandemic and was promoted to full-time president earlier this summer. She also holds a PhD in Latin American literature and has published acclaimed works in that field. Please welcome Dr. Daisy Cocco De Filippis.
Thank you, Eric. Congressman Adriano Espaillat, State Senator John Liu, and Assemblymember Amanda Septimo is joining us at some point, and Council Member Rafael Salamanca. Doña Elba Cabrera from our foundation, so happy you are with us. Dean Ana Garcia Reyes will be joining us at some point as well. And from the President's office, a very special thank you to Victor Santana, Diana Kramer, Eric Radezky, and I thank you to the Hostos family. We're already at 40 and we're just beginning. And so this is an important moment for us. We gather today to note the tragic events that took place on a Tuesday morning in September 2001. What happened then is known the world over. For those of us who were in the city that day, it is etched forever in our memories. I cannot tell you the images I have. When we speak of that day, we say quite rightly that we must never forget the lives lost, the damage incurred, the trauma that lingers to this day and beyond. It is also fitting to say that we must always remember the bright and shining memories of our friends and loved ones, the courage and compassion of all of the New Yorkers in or out of uniform who offer their help to those in need, and the response of the larger world, which rally around a city in pain. As we approach this September 11th, 20 years on from that terrible day, we gather to talk, to listen, to remember, and never forget. Thank you all for joining us. Mil gracias y bendiciones.
Thank you, President. I would now like to introduce Congressman Adriano Espaillat. He represents New York's 13th Congressional District, first elected in 2016 and serving his third term in the House of Representatives. He is the first Dominican American to serve in the U.S. House, and he was the first Dominican American elected to the New York State Legislature, serving as an Assembly member and later as a state senator. He is a member of the powerful House Committee on Appropriations that funds the federal government, and his congressional district includes Harlem, East Harlem, West Harlem, Hamilton Heights, Washington Heights, Inwood, Marble Hill, and the Northwest Bronx. Congressman Espaillat.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. I want to thank, of course, the CUNY family, Chancellor Matos, and of course, your wonderful president of Hostos Community College, Daisy Cocco De Filippis, who began not too long ago, but has already left her mark in CUNY and in also Hostos Community College. We're here to remember 2 decades ago, the horrible day that really marked every New Yorker's life. I think that Hostos, among other colleges in the CUNY family, has suffered dramatically from the attacks of 9/11. But we're also here to establish our resolve and our vision towards the future. 2 decades after this horrible day, America continues to move forward. New York City continues to be a city that provides a gorgeous mosaic for people from all over the world. And CUNY is a university system that provides opportunities also from folks from all walks of life in all places throughout the world that merge here in New York City. So I want to thank the CUNY family for their support of New Yorkers during this horrible time 20 years ago, and also how they assisted us for the past 2 decades as we recover and as we continue to move forward. CUNY, and particularly colleges like Hostos Community College, played a pivotal role in making sure that New York City continued to move forward. We will never forget. We will always remember those that were the emergency workers, the police officers, the firefighters, the EMT workers, people that average New Yorkers that went to the Twin Towers to assist those that perished and those that got hurt during this horrible attack. We will always honor them. We will always remember them. And so I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity 2 decades later to remember this horrible day and to say that we will continue to move forward. I apologize that I have to jump out of the call. I am in the middle of an education and labor committee where, amongst all things, we hope to eventually sometime today or tomorrow approve free community colleges for all Americans. And so this is an important day for that committee, and this is an important day for the Hostos Community College family. Thank you so much, and keep the faith.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Senator John Liu, who represents New York State's 11th Senate District. He is the chair of the State Senate's New York City Education Committee. He is the former comptroller of New York City and a former New York City council member. And he has taught classes in municipal finance and public policy at CUNY and Columbia University. Senator John Liu.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to see everybody here and be in this important event. Thank you, President De Filippis, for the invitation. Once again, Hostos distinguishes itself even among a fantabulous university system like CUNY. Hostos remains a gem in so many different ways, and I'm really proud to be with you. I send greetings from Senator Serrano as well as Senator Rivera, my colleagues in the Boogie Down Bronx. This is an important meeting, event, Zoom, whatever we want to call it, to have. 20 years ago, I know some of the students at Hostos weren't even around 20 years ago, but it has gone by in a flash, and I don't think any of us who witnessed September 11th, especially if you were in New York City, we would never forget what we were doing that day, that hour, those moments. It's just something that stays with you the whole time. And, the unspeakable tragedy that occurred a few days shy of 20 years ago are still in many ways unspeakable. But on the other hand, I think we always like to reflect on the silver lining that actually came out, which is like the incredible human spirit and compassion that we saw all around, people really caring about each other, and the honoring of the first responders, the firefighters, the police officers, the EMS workers, and just regular, average, everyday citizens who help in so many different ways. We saw that 20 years ago after we were attacked, and we still see much semblance of that in this current war of 19, where so many people have died, and families are suffering and grieving. There's economic turmoil, but people are also stepping up in many different ways to help fellow human beings, sisters and brothers. And so I think it's really apropos that we have this meeting and discussion. And so I'll keep my opening comments brief. I will stay with you for the panel to answer any questions or listen to any complaints or suggestions that people may have. Once again, Daisy, thank you so much for not only the invitation, but stepping up and taking the helm of a very important institution in our city at a very difficult time.
Thank you, Senator Liu. We are hopefully going to be joined by some other elected officials and special guests. But before we move on to the first question, I'd like to ask everyone to please join me in a moment of silence as we reflect on this occasion and remember those that we lost 20 years ago. Thank you for that moment of silence. I see we have been joined by Assemblymember Amanda Septimo. She is the Assembly member for the 84th District, which represents Hostos Community College. She is a Bronx native, and her community activism dates back to her teenage years as part of the Points Team Activist Program. Assemblymember, would you like to say a few words before we get started?
Just that I'm grateful to be here, and thank you to everyone who's here. Any Hostos event is always a lovely one, and this is a particularly special one. So thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you all. And I'm sorry for the bit of technical difficulties still figuring out in a Zoom world.
Thank you for joining us. I believe we are also expecting a representative from Councilmember Salamanca. If he's here, please just let us know. If not, I believe we will begin the panel discussion. So as Senator Liu mentioned, many Hostos students today were either not born yet or very young when 9/11 happened. And I think part of the goal of today's event is to communicate what that day and the aftermath was like here in New York City. So let's start with the first question, the one that I think everyone asked each other at the time. Where were you when you first heard the news? And we'll begin with Senator Liu. As I recall, I believe you had an election that day. Yes?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I know exactly where I was. I was standing on the corner of Casina and Geranium in front of the Self-Help Benjamin Rosenthal Senior Center, which was at the time the largest poll site in Flushing. I was running for city council and, working hard, nervous that morning. That was the day of the primary, the Democratic primary, September 11th, 2001. And, I'd already been standing in the same spot for 4 hours since 5 in the morning before the polls opened. And by the time, the first plane hit around 9 o'clock, I heard about some plane, flying into the World Trade Center. You don't really know what to make of it. I really did assume that some small plane got lost and maybe clipped the towers and the pilot and whatever passengers might have perished, never thinking that it could have been a Boeing. And then, 20 minutes later, hearing about another plane. And, I was with my congressman at the time who was campaigning with me, not campaigning against me, campaigning with me. And he got, a lot of news from his staff. And so, we understood the gravity of the situation. And then probably 10, 15 minutes later, we were informed by the Board of Elections workers that the election had been called off. And so, it was just, I rushed home and, my wife rushed home also. She actually had taken the day off and was covering another poll site. And we got home. Our son was, not even 1 year old yet, just a couple of months shy of one. And, it's just, I got home in time to see on TV the first tower crumbling. And it's just, it almost looked like what you would see in the movies, not real life. I'll never forget that moment where you see that the building crumble. And, knowing that there were still, thousands of people in those buildings. Anyway, obviously a lot happened in the days, weeks, and months following. But that morning, you can never forget it.
I have to agree with you, Senator. That was one of those moments in life where everything just seems to stop. And we've had some experiences like that in the past 2 decades, but for me, that was certainly the first. But let's hear from Assemblymember Amanda Septimo. Where were you, Assemblymember, when that happened?
Sure. So like Senator Liu, I think probably like every New Yorker and many people around the country, it's a moment that is completely captured and sort of sealed in my mind. I was actually just into the first few days of 6th grade. I was 10 when 9/11 happened. My school sort of started with a morning assembly, and I went to school about 30 minutes from my house, and we were kind of in our morning assembly. The head of school was giving sort of updates, and she let us know that there was what she presumed to be an accident, which I think many people did initially, and that they were going to be keeping an eye on the situation, et cetera. She was letting students ask questions. And while she was up there, a teacher came up to her, whispered in her ear, and presumably told her that another plane had hit. She didn't inform us of that detail, but she then said, you know, more things have happened and you will all be going home. We'll call your parents and they will come pick you up. And I remember being a little sort of panicked because my school was 30 minutes away from where I lived, at least. And many people in the school went to school like 5 or 10 minutes away. And I was worried that my mom wouldn't be able to get from work and all of these things. And so I walked out of the auditorium and my mom was standing there. And that was, I felt a really sort of deep sense of relief just to kind of be with my mom in this moment that was, you know, really scary. Even as a 10-year-old, I certainly couldn't appreciate the gravity of it when it was happening. But I will also never forget, I grew up in Hunts Point, which you can see the skyline of Manhattan right across the water. And so we could see sort of the buildings in smoke and on fire and kind of watch the wreckage happen. And so we went home and I think we sort of were locked into the news and trying to locate so many of our family members, making sure that they were safe. And just making sure that everyone was accounted for. And, you know, I think still at the time, I couldn't really appreciate the gravity as a 10-year-old of what was really happening. I know that my mom was crying a lot. My parents were really upset, but I couldn't truly wrap my head around the depth of the loss until I got older. And I think that that's something for people who are around my age. It's been a really interesting experience to sort of come of age in a post 9/11 world. Because I remember trips to kind of Disney World where the airport was just much more lax and the airport was a totally different place. And now to live in a post 9/11 world, that's one example of something that is so changed, but really the entire landscape of our world. And everything from politics to how people feel when they're riding the subway and there's a strange sound, right? I think the trauma that lives with New Yorkers is very real and something that exists really no matter what age you were when it happened, if you had any real understanding of what was going on.
Thank you. I think it's interesting that we have different perspectives from people who were different ages at that time. I myself was 20 years old when it happened. I was away at college and, you know, like many 20-year-olds, I thought that I knew everything about the world. And that was one of those days that shows you that unexpected things do happen. Let me ask our next question to both of you. And this is something that perhaps Senator Liu has already touched on. What is the one image that stands out in your mind when you think about that day, 9/11, 20 years ago?
Well, I think the lasting image is what I saw, you know, what I mentioned before, that coming home and seeing for the first time that the towers crumbling. And then even all the way from Flushing, Queens, you could see the smoke in the horizon. And I think that's what I always remember about that day. You just couldn't imagine this kind of attack and the devastation and the loss of life that occurred so quickly. But yeah, that's that's the image that's etched in my brain forever. The towers crumbling. I mean, this is the World Trade Center. It's like, even if you could have damaged it in so many different ways, but you would expect the steel to hold up, and such a massive structure like that just crumbling like a toothpick. You'll never forget that.
Assemblymember?
I'd say there are two things that really stand out for me. The first was in the news coverage. There was a moment where, so we're glued to the TVs, and there was a moment that my mother sort of exclaimed, and she'd been crying and been upset. And I'm still just kind of trying to figure out everything that's wrong. And she exclaimed, and I asked her why she was exclaiming, and she didn't answer. And I think parents do what they can to kind of shield their children. And I remember the news reporter kind of narrating that what we were seeing fall from the buildings was people jumping. And that was something that in the moment, I think started to help me understand some of the gravity, right, that I mentioned. You just couldn't really grasp as a kid, because I started to understand that, like, okay, people were making a decision to jump and to die, and trying to kind of come to terms with what those people must be feeling and thinking, if this is what they think their best option is. And so people jumping is really something that I can see the news footage now if I imagine it. And then the towers falling when they actually fell, because I think up until that point, you're kind of rooting for everyone, and hoping that as many people are racing out as they can, and that first responders are doing what they can, and that as many people are being saved as possible. But when the buildings went down, it sort of sank in, at least for me at 10 years old, that many people were not surviving this, and understanding that this was just like a huge scale of loss of life, which again, I came to appreciate as I got older. But even in that moment, I could really feel.
Thank you. The next question I want to ask is that we used to say the term "never forget." That was in all of the popular press. It was on bumper stickers. But as we came to this 20th anniversary, it seems to me that society-wise, we have forgotten a little. And that's probably just because some time has passed. But I want to ask you both, do you think that we have forgotten? And if so, what do we do?
I don't think we've forgotten. I think we're still very much attuned as a nation, and certainly as a city, to potential terrorist threats and the need for public safety. This, in some ways, I guess, as once we hit the 10th, and then the last few years, I did notice a drop off in the number of 9/11 events. But of course, this year, I mean, between today and the next 3 days, I've got about 20 9/11 events to attend, most of them in person. So I think, even though, time does take away some of the immediate pain, this is 20 years. It's a generation later. We have children of people who died in the towers, some of whom were not even born at the time yet. And so I don't think we ever forget. This is really an unforgettable moment in American and worldwide history, and it'll always be such. As far as lessons we've learned from a public perspective, as I said before, we're still mindful of the need for homeland security and keeping people safe. But I also do think we're doing a better job than the immediate reaction to 9/11 was, which was like the Patriot Act and really scapegoating lot of people, whether they be Sikhs or Muslims or anybody that just, didn't look like they were from New York or from America. So I think enough time has passed that we've learned lessons, and we've learned lessons from the lessons. And now it's just a matter of remembering those lives lost, honoring those families, and maintaining this special place in our memory, for better or for worse, about what happened on September 11, 2001.
Assemblymember Septimo.
Yeah, I think I agree with Senator Liu that there's no way you're a New Yorker who was there and forgot any part of it. I think everyone who was here can be transported right back. I do think that shamefully, some of the things that we've forgotten was the level of sacrifice that first responders and that folks who were just there, who didn't sign up for the sacrifice, right, sort of unwittingly made. And I think the fact that we see that it took so many years for us to properly fund healthcare for first responders who were suffering from diseases that we know were related to the fact that they responded on 9/11 is really shameful, right? And is an example of some of the forgetting, right? So of course we can't forget the trauma, but forgetting that to rebuild in these moments of emergency and to make it through them. There are people at every step of the way, especially at the front lines, who are putting their lives and their bodies and that of their families on the line. And we should do better to honor that sacrifice and that commitment. And so I think if there's anything we've forgotten, it's how much people really gave that day. And I think that that's something that we could always do better by way of honoring, not only through these wonderful commemorative events, but also by making sure that they have everything they need on the other side. And that means, first responders who are there and whose families suffered, but I think also first responders today, because there's always another emergency coming, whether it's a climate emergency, but hopefully not another terrorist attack, but there's always another emergency on the way. And these are going to be the people who help us get through it and help us get to the other side of it and rebuild on the other side. And I think that we could do more to honor those sacrifices then, and honor the sacrifices that are made now as well.
Thank you. You actually anticipated one of my questions. I want to call attention to the FDNY, who lost 343 firefighters that day as the towers collapsed. In the immediate aftermath, there was no one more cheered or celebrated here in New York City than members of the FDNY. How do we honor them and other first responders today?
Well, Eric, I think Assemblymember Septimo already answered that question, and I think whether it be city and state government or the federal government, there seems to be a commitment, certainly from Congress, to continue the Zadroga Act and the associated benefits, because this was an attack against our nation, and so the federal government certainly has stepped up, and I think they'll continue to step up. In New York City and state, we continue to hold our first responders, specifically the firefighters and police officers and EMS workers, with high regard in terms of the kind of work they do to keep us safe. Now, obviously, we've also in recent years discussed the need for police reform and those kinds of issues. I always treat those issues as more of a systemic issue and need for systemic reform. But the vast majority of the people who are in these uniformed services are in there for the right reasons, trying to do something good with their careers and with their lives to help people. So that's a balance that I think can be made and will continue to be made, but we certainly don't diminish the important responsibilities that these first responders and uniformed service members provide.
I will second all of that. And I think the only thing that I'd add is that we certainly do more to put our money where our mouth is. EMS workers have been fighting for parity and pay for entirely too long. And there are so many things, especially coming out of a pandemic, there are so many things that feel obvious And it takes public policy a little bit too long to catch up. And that's one example. So I think the way, again, we keep honoring these sacrifices is making sure that we're honoring the sacrifices that are happening today as well. And that means making sure that people are able to sign up for these incredible careers that give so much to us and not having to be making sacrifices in their personal life with their family. Because we know that when push comes to shove, they're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for us. And we should honor that commitment every single day.
Thank you. Next question. To what extent was 9/11 a uniquely New York tragedy? I know it was an attack on our nation and there were planes in DC and Pennsylvania, but I always got the feeling it was a little different for those of us from New York than from other parts of the country.
I mean, it certainly was an attack against our country, but it happened right in our city. And that's, New York City is the center, is a symbol of America to the rest of the world, right? When you're in all far reaches of the world and you think of America, what do you think of? I mean, maybe I'm being a little bit New York centric here, but do you think of, I'm not trying to cast dispersions on our nation's capital, right? But like, I'm thinking like, people in Brazil, people in China, people in the Czech Republic, they're thinking of America. Are they thinking about the Washington Monument? Or were they thinking of the World Trade Center or the Empire State Building as symbols of America? I think a lot of people, see New York being a synonym with America. And so it was directly an attack against the United States of America. It happened right in our city. So, I don't think, I think one of the big mistakes that the federal government made in 2002, shortly after the 2001 attack, was, they put aside a significant amount of funding in the federal budget for Homeland Security. And instead of directing those funds to where the actual risks were, risks of terrorist attack, somehow, many months later after the budget sausage making process, Congress decided to allocate those anti-terrorism Homeland Security funds on a per capita basis, meaning they just simply allocated it by population, headcount proportions. That didn't make any sense. I mean no disrespect to my fellow Americans in Wyoming, but it's not a terrorist target like New York City is, and that should have been where the funding was directed. It should be where the funding should be directed going forward. But your question of, well, do we feel different because we're New Yorkers? Yeah, we're on the front lines, much more so than most other places in this country. Obviously Washington, our nation's capital, is a target also. But I dare say that more people around the world outside the United States associate New York City with America, maybe even more so than Washington itself. Now I'm just being a rash and rude New Yorker.
I definitely agree with so much of what Senator Liu said. And I also think that this feels like a uniquely New York tragedy because it really is, right? The entire nation was being attacked, but it's in New York that you find people who can name someone who passed, right? I was looking in the chat and someone had mentioned that the former director of IT, Mr. Charles Lesperance, died in the towers, right? It's here that you find you find people who can name families who are still missing someone because of this thing that happened. And it's here that you can meet kids who never got to meet a parent or who don't remember an uncle or who, and the list goes on and on and on, right? And it's almost impossible to find someone who was here at the time who doesn't know someone who lost someone, right? And I have several friends who lost a parent, lost an uncle, lost a cousin. And those are the things that I think make it a uniquely New York tragedy, because it is one thing to read about something on the news, but it is another thing to experience it long after the news cycle is over. And that's what's happened with 9/11. And I think it goes back to the point about never forget. Obviously, the news cycle around 9/11 is over, and we'll see it pop up in the news now because of the 20th anniversary. But those families are still missing that person, right? And we're, as New Yorkers, anytime there's something strange in the subway, I get a pang of panic and think, like, what if this is the time that there's an attack and I'm here for it, right? And so, like, the trauma lives on, the gaps live on, and the sadness lives on. And I think that the phrase never forget is an interesting one, because if you're a New Yorker, you really couldn't forget, even if you tried. And there are so many families who will never be able to forget. And I think that is a really unique experience for this city, and particularly for the people who were here when it happened.
Thank you. That leads to my next question. How has politics in New York City, changed because of 9/11?
I think it changed a lot. It changed the way we look at things. It changed the nature of our government. The immediate impact of the 9/11 attack was that not only was it physically devastating, but it devastated our city's finances. Right, a major sector of our economy was completely destroyed, and surrounding areas disabled. There was tremendous job loss and flight from the city. It was when I just started in the city council, and after promising that I would never raise taxes, within a few months in my first year as a member of the city council, I voted for the biggest tax hike in history. Every time I take out the garbage, my neighbor still reminds me of that vote I took. And, we had to, because the gap in the budget directly resulting from the 9/11 attacks, we would have had to, close a third of our schools and decimated a variety of city services. So instead, we had to make some cuts in the city budget, but we also had to ask people to pay more. The infamous property tax hike, that people don't forget that, and people don't forget the people like myself who voted for it to stabilize our budget. So it has short-term immediate impacts in city politics, and it continues to have long-term because, Homeland Security is still a priority. Keeping people safe is a priority. But, I've talked about how September 11th, we really kind of placed a great deal of trust on, say, the police department to keep people safe. But we went beyond that. We, as a city, we went into the business of Homeland Security. And at the time, I remember a lot of the discussion was that, we can't rely on the Bush administration. This was, President George Bush at the time, and the federal government to help New York City, especially when, as I mentioned before, the city, the Homeland Security, instead of being directed to the places that had the greatest risk of terrorist attack, it then became like what some people would call a pork barrel item allocated by headcount. And so that was kind of like, it kind of dissed New York City in a bad way. And so we didn't want to rely on them. And therefore we started giving, our police department all sorts of high-tech equipment for surveillance, for weaponry. And then we see, in 2019, weapons that local police forces, including NYPD, were using against our own people, right? So it kind of came full cycle where we gave the police a great deal of equipment and physical power to protect us. And then, almost 20 years later, those weapons and that equipment and technology was still being used, but not necessarily to defend us against terrorist attacks. So, there's a lot of different ways that it has changed the politics. And when I say change the politics is public policy. Public policy is a direct result of politics. Politics is, it's not a dirty word, it's democracy. It's what people think, it's what people feel.
I would, obviously I was not yet in politics when 9/11 happened, but I think that if I had to think about one major change, I think that 9/11 was extremely precedent setting by way of national emergencies, and specifically thinking about FEMA disaster declarations. Because of the nature of the emergency with 9/11, because it was a terrorist attack, I think there was this flare up of patriotism, right? And so pouring resources back into rebuilding New York was a no-brainer, right? And people were excited to see New York come back because it meant that the country was rebuilding from this really vulnerable moment. Now, if you fast forward to the pandemic, we have seen New York particularly hard hit, and the federal government at the time sort of deciding whether this counted as a national emergency in the way that New York should be compensated for bearing the brunt of that emergency the way it was for 9/11. And I think that obviously we've seen that with a change in administration, those conversations are moving forward. But I think had 9/11 not happened, the entire world would be different. But that specifically, that precedent to say, well, hey, here was another national sort of disaster that targeted one place, and this place was sort of rebuilt, and it just happens to be the same place. It happens to be New York again. And I think that when I think about the pandemic and sort of the politics around funding and making sure that we were able to get enough money to New York State to start rebuilding, I do think that 9/11 set an important precedent with regard to that.
I agree. Let me ask, for parallels between 9/11 and the COVID-19 response, how does 9/11 inform how government responds to COVID-19 here in New York City, and especially, I would say, the economic response?
I'm just going to re-up what I just said.
I would agree with that also. Ostensibly, they're two very different kinds of attacks, right? I mean, one was a terrorist attack carried out by people. The other is an attack on everyone, right? But by a virus, an invisible virus. How people have succumbed to this are different, obviously, but the impact is still the same. People losing their family members, people losing their livelihoods and jobs, and our whole way of life has changed, right? After 9/11, it was you can't, make sure you don't leave your school bag on the bench in the park or in the subway. Metal detectors everywhere, including, by the way, City Hall, where a city council member was assassinated not long after 9/11. We had to change our way of life after 9/11. Security, everything had to be signed in, a proliferation of cameras. And now with COVID, we're all now wearing masks. We've even gotten better at identifying, recognizing people just by looking at their eyes, as opposed to relying on the rest of their face. And socially distancing, washing our hands all the time. So both attacks, they literally changed our daily lives. And the longer term impacts the economic impacts, we're going to feel it for a long time. We felt it very acutely in the city and the state immediately after COVID hit. Excuse me. Thankfully, eventually the federal government came through, and they did provide a substantial amount of assistance to state and local governments. We kept our schools open and as well equipped as possible. Other services largely kept intact, although there are clearly a few shortcomings. But the federal government, the deficit of the federal government has really gone through the roof. If you had asked me 2 years ago if the federal deficit could be anywhere what it is today, I would have said that would be a crazy notion. But here we are. So, the impact has definitely been felt, and there are similar, although there are overt differences between the 9/11 attack and COVID-19, there are some stark similarities.
And I think the only thing that I would add is, not to be so kind of flowery and into the patriotism of being American, but I do think that both of these crises, separated by 20 years, almost 20 years, have really drawn into focus the question of, or the strength of the union, the strength of the United States as a union. And what does it mean to be in this together? And does an emergency that happens or a disaster that strikes 750 miles away from you matter to you? Should your tax dollars go into rebuilding that part of a nation that you might never go to or visit? And I think that both of those disasters really begged that question. And again, because of the nature of 9/11, there was a flare-up of patriotism, and the answer was yes, absolutely, because we wanted to rebuild and we wanted to show strength and unity. And in COVID, I think there's a combination of the politics of the moment, the kind of question around news and all of those kinds of things that make it a little more complicated. But the answer that's come up isn't a resounding yes. And I think that that's actually something that's really unfortunate. But again, I do think that 9/11 set an important precedent that has helped us really be able to draw on it from an economic perspective and say, this is a national emergency. We got hit the most, and we should all be sharing the burden to rebuild. And I think, to not play naive, none of us can deny the role that New York plays in the economic base for the federal government, and the fact that we pay a lot more into the system than we get back ultimately. And so I think that's for me kind of a frustrating part of having to always fight for what feels like should be ours automatically.
Thank you. We're going to pause with questions for a moment to hear from a few members of the Hostos community. But I would also like to ask anyone who has a question for our elected officials to please drop them in the chat over the next few moments. First, I want to go to Shalika Ellington, a former Navy service person, honorably discharged, now a Hostos student. Shalika, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Shalika, as mentioned. I was called upon to read a brief poem, but I just wanted to speak a little on where I was at personally during 9/11. I'm 29 years old, so during 9/11, I was in 3rd grade, and I can remember almost like it was yesterday how the commotion that happened around. Although I was quite young, I still have fond memories, especially because my sister was actually went to school near the World Trade Center. So everyone was kind of in ruckus and trying to figure out what was going on with her and where she was at the time. And, parents going to pick students up from school because of all that was going on. But, and of course, being in the military, we were told that nothing would ever be the same again. We would never be alpha, nothing would be normal. We will always have to remain on high alert with all that has gone on after 9/11. So I was called upon to read a poem today, and I chose a poem by Billy Collins, The Names. and it reads, "Yesterday I lay awake in the palm of the night, a soft rain stole in unhelped by any breeze. And when I saw the silver glaze on the windows, I started with Ackerman as it happened, then Baxter and Calabro, Davis and Eberling, names falling into place as droplets fell through the dark, names printed on the ceiling of the night, names slipping around a watery bend, 26 willows on the banks of a stream. In the morning, I walked out barefoot among thousands of flowers, heavy with a dew like the eyes of tears, and each had a name. Flory inscribed on a yellow petal, then Gonzalez in hand. Ishikawa and Jenkins, names written in the air and stitched into the cloth of the day. A name under a photograph taped to a mailbox. Monogram on a torn shirt, I see you spelled out a storefront. On storefront windows, I'm sorry. And on the bright unfurled awnings of the city. I saw the syllables as I turned the corner. Kelly and Lee, Medina, Nardella, and O'Connor. When I peer into the woods, I see a thick tangle where letters are hidden, as in a puzzle concocted for children. Parker and Quigley in the twigs of an ash, Rizzo, Schubert, Torres, and Upton. Secrets in the boughs of an ancient maple. Names written in the pale sky. Names rising in the updraft amid buildings. Names silent in stone or cried out behind a door. Names blown over the earth and out to sea. In the evening, weakening light, the last swallows. A boy on a lake lifts his oars. A woman by a window puts a match to a candle, and the names are outlined on the rose clouds. Vanacore and Wallace. The young and Samiski, the final jaw of Z.
Thank you, Shalika.
I don't know where you guys are. You're welcome.
I would now like to call on Elbagina Bonilla from the Hostos Department of Student Development and Enrollment Management, who would like to read the name of her family member who was lost on 9/11. Elbagina?
Hi, sorry about that. Yes, my brother-in-law actually passed away on 9/11. His name is Alejandro Cordero. And I didn't meet the Cordero family till 16 years ago when I met my husband. But to this day, it's not easy, still hard. And now coming up to the 20th anniversary, it's getting even harder to even believe that this is happening. He would have been 43 years old now. My daughter and my nieces, they hear a lot of stories about him, and they act like him according to my in-laws, but they still saddened even though they don't know the history because they weren't born at that time. So we try to tell them stories every other time that we can with him and the positive light of what New York is and how we push through. It's still sad though, but we have to push through.
Thank you for sharing that. I can tell that even after all these years, it's not easy to talk about.
It definitely is not.
If there's anyone else here in the Zoom meeting who would like to honor someone who was lost on 9/11 and share their name or brief remembrance, please feel free to speak up now. Okay, if there are no other remembrances, I would like to play a video message that we have from Sergeant First Class Ricardo Garcia, U.S. Army retired, and he is the Hostos Veterans Affairs Coordinator. Victor, do we have that message?
Hello, Hostos Community College. It is a pleasure to be amongst you here today on the 20th anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks. As most of you know, I am the veteran coordinator here on campus, and I work with the Hostos Office of Veterans Affairs. And in that capacity, I work with our veteran population and our military service members that attend this institution. But what many of you don't know is that in addition to me being a service member, I am also a World Trade Center 9/11 responder. I was there on that horrific day as the events unfolded. I personally witnessed and was present as the towers collapsed. In addition to that fateful day, I also returned in a military capacity to do search and rescue and to assist in the World Trade Center recovery operations. I spent months at Ground Zero alongside many of our heroic firefighters, police, NYPD, Port Authority, and multitudes of law enforcement agencies, as well as iron workers and EMS. It is important for us to remember the selfless sacrifice and service that these individuals have made in America's time of need. But in addition to their selfless service and sacrifice that we honor, we must also remember those lost and those that never returned home. For those countless families that lost their loved ones, we must always remember to keep those individuals' memories alive through the memorial and through our tribute. It is important that we as New Yorkers pay forward those heroic actions and good deeds that were done on September 11th to keep the foundation of this country strong. But more importantly, we must always remember that the true resolve of the United States is within our ability to maintain our humanity and compassion for one another. With this, I humbly conclude my message, and I ask that you, with me, pay tribute in honoring the memory of the responders and the lives lost. Thank you very much for your time. God bless you. Stay safe. And God bless America.
All right. Thank you, Sergeant First Class Ricardo Garcia. I do not believe we have had any questions entered into the chat. A few people sharing their condolences, which we all appreciate. So seeing no questions in the chat, I will just ask our panelists, is there anything else you want to say about this 20th anniversary of 9/11 before we close the event?
I would urge everybody to follow through on the notion of not forgetting. And that means talking with your children, your family members, your students or colleagues about what happened that day. And, this Saturday, I think the weather's going to be really good. Go out to, go attend in person, masks, of course, at least one event so that you really are like in the moment of what happened 20 years ago. I think that, and the more we remember it, the more we avoid having mistakes of the past repeated. That's why we say never forget.
I would only offer, I guess, two things. First, that it is okay to still feel sad about 9/11, even though it was 20 years ago. Because if it feels like yesterday to you, then that's okay. Because there are as many New Yorkers as there are, when taken globally, it's a small amount of people who can really understand what you're going through. But we all understand. And so it is okay to feel the feelings. If you watch the ringing of the bell, the reading of the names, I'm always amazed at how emotional it is for me. And I didn't personally lose anyone that day. And so it's okay to feel those emotions and to not understand them. And you don't have to kind of run from them because it was traumatic and it is going to be with us forever. And that's okay, because it is just part of our story as New Yorkers. And that is something that we shouldn't run away from. And then I think for anyone who knows someone who lost someone or who lost someone themselves, to work on just keeping those memories alive, just like we heard Miss Bonilla talking about earlier, to telling the stories and making sure that even for the people who don't know anyone who was impacted, telling the story of what happened and what it felt like to be in this place to people who weren't there at all. My younger brother has no memory of it. And we tell him what it was like because it was so fundamentally life-changing and world-changing and changed every part of everyone's life. And it's something that should be understood as more than a footnote in a textbook. And that only happens if we keep the stories alive. And so to Senator Liu's point about not forgetting, that only happens if we take charge of making sure that the painful parts of the stories, but also the powerful ones, continue to be told.
Eric, can I just say that Assemblymember Septimo had to start a lot of her comments with, I agree, or I would only add that. And I want everybody to know that that's only because Eric kept letting the old guy go first. And so I wound up talking about most of the issues that Amanda certainly would have brought up herself. But you have a terrific assembly member who I follow all the time in Albany.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very kind of you. And I do agree with everything he says. So lucky me.
I would like to just say a couple of words of thank you to everyone for your generous participation. Assemblymember Septimo, so lovely to have you with us again. I want to remind, I don't know that he needs to be reminded of that because I don't think he remembers, but I was for a long time a resident of Flushing. And I remember running into you in the street, I think it was 45th Avenue, and some of your staffers with a petition that you were going to run for office. And I did stop and I did sign, and I am so happy I did today, just to hear what a wonderful, wonderful representative you are of so many of the values we all share. Amanda Septimo being one of the youngest, I can't imagine. You know, my children are much older than you at this point. I am so incredibly proud. And I want to say for Ms. Bonilla, thank you for sharing the poem. And for Senor Garcia, thank you for remembering. I am so grateful to the Hostos family and the extended family of Hostos that you see represented here. Congressman Espaillat was with us for a while, and he needed to go back to a meeting. He's promising a lot of support for the community colleges, so we're looking forward to that. And so thank you for that. And I do remember the smoke, Senator Liu. I do remember the smoke, and I do remember driving from my house to your college. I was halfway through when I heard on the radio at 8:10 in the morning, or a little before 8 o'clock. And I said, what do I do? So I continued, duty call, so I continued to go to work. And our president, they was so wonderful. He just gathered everybody together to kind of reflect and to talk and to just be together. And Assemblymember Septimo, those images that they showed in the news, I can't imagine, of folks jumping from the buildings, that haunts me till this day. Yeah, it's very powerful. And these are images, the desperation and the absolute anguish of those folks, just hoping that there would be a net somewhere, somehow to catch them. So thank you, Eric Radezky, Dr. Radezky, for your wonderful contribution, and Diana Kramer, who is the heart of our office, for all her good work. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Just one more time, I want to check to see if there's anyone here present today who would like to add anything before we close. Okay, seeing no further questions, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank our guests, Senator John Liu, Assemblymember Amanda Septimo, Congressman Adriano Espaillat, President Daisy Cocco De Filippis, of course, our Hostos family members, Elbachina Bonilla, Shalika Ellington, and Sergeant First Class Ricardo Garcia for bringing their messages. And of course, all of the Hostos staff who helped us put this event together, including Diana Kramer and Victor Santana from the President's Office. Thank you all very much for marking this somber occasion with us. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Never forget.